Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Have an excellent Wednesday, everyone. Now, pay attention because a major question is starting to take shape around the Pittsburgh Steelers as training camp moves forward, and it has nothing to do with whether this team has enough talent. The bigger question is what this roster can actually become in 2026, because one new evaluation has placed the Steelers among the 5 most stacked rosters in the entire NFL. That is a very different picture from the idea that Pittsburgh is simply a team trying to survive another season. Bleacher Report recently released its NFL 1000 rankings, a system designed to evaluate the league's top 1,000 players, and then use those individual evaluations to determine which teams have the deepest overall rosters. And according to that measurement, the Steelers landed at number 5 in the NFL. Only the Houston Texans, Philadelphia Eagles, Detroit Lions, and one other team ranked ahead of Pittsburgh in the final evaluation. That puts the Steelers ahead of teams such as the Baltimore Ravens, Denver Broncos, Seattle Seahawks, San Francisco 49ers, and Buffalo Bills. Now, that ranking immediately creates an interesting debate because Bleacher Report's own explanation of the Steelers almost sounds more negative than the number 5 ranking suggests. The argument is that Pittsburgh has significant talent throughout the roster, but perhaps does not have enough elite, top-of-the-league individual talent to take the final step. Their highest-ranked Steelers player in this evaluation is center Zach Frazier, who comes in at number 64 overall. Pittsburgh is also the only team in the top group that does not have a player ranked inside the top 30, and honestly, that may be one of the most fascinating things about this Steelers team. This is not necessarily a roster built around one superstar at every position. Instead, the strength appears to be balanced. There is veteran experience, there is younger talent, and there are fewer obvious weaknesses across the starting units. The evaluation describes Pittsburgh as having a more robust roster, although also an aging one. But if you look at the bigger picture, the fact that the Steelers can rank 5th despite not having multiple players among the very top names in the league tells you something important. This roster has depth and quality spread across the football team, and that matters because Pittsburgh is entering a season where expectations are changing. There are certainly no guarantees that this team is going to win the Super Bowl. Nobody should pretend that a number 5 roster ranking automatically translates into a championship, but the same evaluation suggests that this could be one of the most competitive Steelers teams in recent years, potentially giving Pittsburgh a legitimate opportunity to make noise when January arrives. The assessment even points to this being the best equipped Steelers roster to make a postseason run in at least the last half-decade. At the same time, there are other developments happening around the roster that make this evaluation even more interesting. The Steelers have added 2 wide receivers to their 90-man preseason roster, Isaiah Winstead and Cornell Powell. Winstead is 27 years old, stands 6'4", and weighs 213 pounds, and previously spent time on the New York Jets' practice squad where he had experience around Aaron Rodgers. His most recent UFL season with Louisville produced 29 receptions for 474 yards and 3 touchdowns, and he helped Louisville win the UFL title. Then there is Cornell Powell, a 28-year-old receiver who has spent time with Kansas City and was also on Pittsburgh's practice squad last year. Powell led the UFL in touchdown receptions this season with 7, while finishing with 29 catches for 418 yards. The Steelers are clearly giving these players an opportunity to compete for a place within the deeper receiver group, particularly after releasing several other wide receivers in recent days. But while those roster moves are interesting, the biggest conversation may still be Aaron Rodgers. There is already speculation from some media personalities that Rodgers could somehow be traded before the NFL trade deadline if the Steelers struggle badly during the first half of the season. One proposed scenario even suggested Pittsburgh could swap Rodgers for Minnesota quarterbacks Kyler Murray and JJ McCarthy, but the current reality presented in the report is very different. The Steelers are happy with Rodgers as their starting quarterback, and the argument that he could suddenly demand a trade does not line up with what Rodgers has publicly said about why he returned for another season. Rodgers has repeatedly indicated that Mike McCarthy's arrival in Pittsburgh was the reason he decided to return for a 22nd NFL season. That is a crucial detail. If Rodgers came back specifically because he wanted to play for McCarthy, then the idea that he would suddenly want out simply because the Steelers had a difficult stretch becomes much harder to understand. And even if that situation somehow developed, there is another question. How many legitimate contenders would actually be looking for a starting quarterback who is 42 years old at the trade deadline? Then there is another quarterback rumor that deserves attention, this time involving Baker Mayfield and the 2027 offseason. Mike Florio has suggested that Mayfield could potentially take less money to play for Pittsburgh, but there are several reasons why that scenario looks extremely difficult. Mayfield has reportedly turned down an offer worth more than $50 million per season, which makes the idea of him voluntarily taking substantially less money to leave Tampa Bay difficult to envision. And even if Pittsburgh wanted to pursue him, the Steelers' salary cap situation would create a major obstacle. The report states that Pittsburgh had only about $2.3 million in available cap space for the 2027 offseason at that point, before potential extensions for players such as Joey Porter Jr. and Keeanu Benton. So when you put all of this together, you get a fascinating picture of the Steelers. On one side, you have outside speculation questioning whether Pittsburgh could collapse badly enough to move on from Rodgers during the season. On the other, you have an independent roster evaluation placing Pittsburgh 5th in the entire NFL. You have new receivers fighting for roster spots, veterans returning from injuries, and a team that appears to have considerably more balance than some people are willing to acknowledge. And perhaps that is the real story heading into this season. The Steelers do not necessarily need to have the most famous player at every position. They need the entire roster to function together. They need the veterans to stay healthy, the younger players to develop, and the team to turn that balance into consistent production on Sundays. That is why this number 5 ranking is so important. It does not promise a championship, but it does challenge the idea that Pittsburgh is entering 2026 with a weak roster or a team that is simply hoping everything goes right. So now I want to hear from Steelers Nation. If Bleacher Report has Pittsburgh as the 5th most stacked roster in the NFL, do you believe the Steelers really have a top 5 roster on paper? Or do you think that ranking is too high? And there is another part of this story that Steelers fans should be watching very closely: the injury situation. Pittsburgh had to conduct most of its practice indoors at the indoor training facility in Latrobe because storms were moving through the area, and several players had different levels of participation. Michael Pittman Jr., Sebastian Joseph Day, and Logan Lee did not practice, although the report indicated that Pittman's injury was expected to be extremely minor and that he should return soon. There was less information available regarding Joseph Day and Logan Lee, so their situations were still something to monitor as the week continued. There were also some encouraging developments. Safety Jaquan Brisker, offensive tackle Maxiner, and Eli Hayden were able to return to practice in a limited capacity. They did not participate in team drills, but simply seeing them back on the field for individual work was a positive step. Brandon Echols also had a notable development after dealing with an ankle sprain. He had been wearing a walking boot during Saturday Night Lights, but he was out of that boot during the next practice. That does not mean he is immediately ready to return to full action, especially considering how serious the sprain appeared to be, but it is still a step in the right direction, and this is exactly why the next few practices matter so much. The Steelers are approaching their first preseason game of the year against the Green Bay Packers, with the final practice before that game coming next. The team is moving from the evaluation stage of training camp toward an actual preseason game, meaning players competing for roster spots are going to have opportunities to show what they can do in a much more competitive environment. For players like Winstead and Powell, that opportunity could be extremely important. They are not entering a receiver room where roster spots are simply handed out. The Steelers have already made several moves at the position, and these two additions are another indication that the team is continuing to evaluate its depth. Winstead brings size and previous experience around Rodgers, while Powell already knows the organization after spending time on Pittsburgh's practice squad. Now they have a chance to prove that they belong. But coming back to the bigger picture, the roster evaluation is what really puts everything into perspective. The Steelers have not had an individual player ranked inside the top 30 of the Bleacher Report NFL 1000, yet the team still finished 5th overall in the roster rankings. That tells you that the strength is not necessarily concentrated in one or two players. It is spread throughout the roster. And if that balance translates onto the field, Pittsburgh could become much harder to beat than people expect. There is also a reason why the idea of this being one of the better Steelers rosters in recent years deserves attention. The team has a combination of established veterans and younger players who are still developing. There are not many glaring holes when looking at the projected first-team offense and defense, at least according to the assessment in the report. That does not mean every position is perfect, but it does mean Pittsburgh appears to have fewer obvious weaknesses than it has has had in previous seasons. And that brings us back to the Aaron Rodgers speculation. If this roster really is as balanced as the ranking suggests, then the idea of Pittsburgh giving up on Rodgers at the trade deadline becomes even harder to understand. The entire point of bringing in an experienced quarterback is to see whether a talented roster can turn that talent into postseason success. Trading Rodgers halfway through the season would represent a massive change in direction, and nothing in the information from this report indicates that Pittsburgh is planning to make that kind of move. The speculation is built around a hypothetical disaster scenario. Pittsburgh starts poorly, perhaps around 2-6, and everything begins falling apart. But that is a hypothetical. It is not something that has happened. And the Steelers are entering the season with a roster that has now received a top 5 evaluation. There is another important detail here. The criticism of Mike McCarthy's first season with Dallas is also being challenged by the circumstances surrounding that season. McCarthy went 6-10 in his first year with the Cowboys, but Dak Prescott suffered a major lower body injury in Week 5, forcing Dallas to rely on backup